It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10. Our top story. Labour withdraws its support for Azhar Ali over offensive comments about October the 7th attacks on Israel after it originally backed the Rochdale by-election candidate.
If there is more stuff, as I said, it's inevitable, I'm afraid, and it is a total mess. It's absolute chaos.
Also tonight, inside the fighting in Rafah, now home to 1.5 million Gazan refugees, as Israel is told to think carefully about a ground invasion.
We are very concerned about the situation and we want Israel to stop and think very seriously before it takes any further action.
Now they're packed into Rafah, exposed and vulnerable. They need to be protected.
Nottingham police to be investigated over its contact with the man who killed 3 people in the attacks last June. The schoolyard turned combat training site. We have a special report from Sudan, where millions of people are now displaced in conflict between the security forces. The areas of outstanding natural beauty drowned in raw sewage, as water bosses are told they could lose their bonuses. World Athletics pays tribute to marathon record holder Kelvin Kiptum, who was killed in a car crash. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight. Good evening. Labour's candidate for the Rochdale by-election has been dropped by the party tonight over remarks he made about Israel. Azhar Ali said Israel had allowed Hamas to carry out the October the 7th attacks so it could invade Gaza. Originally, Labour got Ali to apologise, but continued to back him as a candidate. Then it was revealed tonight by Sky News that the party received an official complaint. And a couple of hours ago, the Labour Party withdrew its support with just over 2 weeks to go until voters in Rochdale go to the polls. Our political correspondent, Rob Powell, has tonight's top story.
A candidate now with no party. Labour has tonight withdrawn its support from Azhar Ali in the Rochdale by-election. The party had stood by him for 48 hours, despite reports that he'd claimed Israel allowed the Hamas attacks to take place. Now, a complete change.
Why wasn't suggesting that Israel allowed October the 7th to happen? Why didn't that cross the threshold?
Well, Mr. Ali issued a full apology for his initial comments, but since then, new information has come to light, which meant that we had to take the difficult but necessary decision this evening to withdraw support from his candidacy.
A very different message from just yesterday morning.
He will be your candidate in Rochdale.
In the upcoming by-election, yes, he will.
Is it acceptable for Azhar Ali to remain a candidate?
The Labour leader dodging questions all day.
Associate itself.
But that silence increasingly untenable after a campaign group lodged an official party complaint about Azhar Ali.
Since when did we put the colour of the rosette before fighting hatred? I thought we'd learnt this lesson. We've been there before. We don't put careers or the colour of the rosette before fighting hate, before our morals. You know, this is just Rochdale, but the country is watching.
When the U-turn eventually came, even Labour's most seasoned veterans were left shocked.
And it is a total mess. It's absolute chaos. And I think there's a whole range of issues now that will be debated within the community about where people will go in terms of the votes on the day itself. I've never seen anything like this, to be honest.
It's now too late to change candidates in Rochdale, so Azhar Ali will still appear as Labour's choice on ballot papers, despite not having the backing of the party. It was just yesterday that front benchers were appearing alongside Mr Ali on the campaign trail, and it was just this morning that shadow ministers were suggesting that his initial apology was sufficient.
Lagging in the polls, the Tories have spied a political opportunity and accused Labour of being slow to act.
I was aghast that Labour hadn't dealt with it more effectively and more quickly than it has. It would be inconceivable, frankly, for the Labour Party to give this man the whip, should he be returned, and I hope he won't be, should he be returned as the MP for Rochdale.
A by-election thrown into disarray, Rival party Reform UK questioned why it took Labour so long to act, while the Workers' Party of Britain said the party had brought disgrace to the constituency. The Lib Dems said the comments were already unacceptable. An old issue causing new problems for Sir Keir Starmer, a question of judgment and political priorities. With an election looming, it won't be the last.
Well, here is the full list of candidates and the political parties they represent in the Rochdale by-election. This is after the Labour Party withdrew its support for Azhar Ali. Well, Robert joins me now live from Westminster. And Robert, a shock U-turn from Labour tonight. Just how damaging is this for the Labour Party?
This is a total mess for Labour, and I think many in the party will be wondering this evening how much of the damage could have been limited if they had just acted earlier and distanced themselves from the candidate earlier. In terms of how damaging it is, I think there's a few things to consider. Firstly, it's what this has done to relations with the Jewish community, the failure to act earlier. Then, of course, there is the political context to this. Labour says that new information came to light and that after they had investigated. We don't know what that is yet, but be in no doubt, this is a complete 180 from where the party was just 12 hours ago, and the Tories will seize on that and add it to their list of U-turns that they've been using to attack Sir Keir Starmer with. Then I think there is a genuine question about the quality of decision-making going on at the top of Labour at the moment. It doesn't help that this comes days after that U-turn on the £28 billion green investment pledge, a decision that was accused by some of being botched by the Labour leader. Now, they're completely different topics, but what they have in common is they both did a degree of damage to the party to get to the point of the U-turn that many will think is unnecessary. And I think it's that final point that will be worrying many in Labour the most this evening.
Rob, thank you. Israel has been told to stop and think before reacting by the UK Foreign Secretary after the latest barrage of attacks on the south of Gaza. Thousands of people, many of whom have fled fighting further north, are now waiting nervously to see if the Israeli military starts a ground invasion in Rafah. Lord Cameron said today there is nowhere for the civilians to go and it's time to find a permanent, sustainable ceasefire. And Joe Biden said in the last hour that those people in Rafah need to be protected. We'll get more on the US President's comments in just a moment. But first, let's have a look at what's happening in Rafah in southern Gaza. Well, last night, 2 hostages were rescued. They were amongst 8 people taken by Hamas on the 7th of October from Kibbutz Nir Yitzhak, less than 2 miles from the Gaza border. They were rescued in a raid by Israeli troops from the southern city of Rafah before the houses were destroyed in airstrikes. The IDF also stepped up their aerial bombardment of other areas of Rafah overnight. It comes ahead of an expected Israeli advance into the last major population centre in Gaza, now home to more than 1.4 million people, according to UNRWA. These images, taken by the satellite company Planet, are 3 months apart. They show the scale of the tent cities set up across Rafah. The southern area is also home to the only 2 entry points for life-saving food, fuel and medicine, the Rafah crossing from Kerem Shalom. Israel's allies are urging them to reconsider an offensive on Rafah, with nowhere left for civilians to go. Previously, the IDF said people should move to Al-Mawasi, but aid agencies say the coastal town doesn't have the facilities for so many people. And with between half and 2/3 of Gaza now destroyed or damaged, returning to the north is also not an option for many. A warning that this report from Diana Magnay in Jerusalem contains images of injured people and body bags.
They're in our hands. The voice calm over the radio. But what a moment this is. Israeli special forces shielding the hostages as they go into an armed convoy and out of Rafah to safety. In the helicopter en route home, 70-year-old Luis Ha and 61-year-old Fernando Simon Marmon, stunned at this sudden rescue. They're asked if they want a blanket, but no, it's warm, they say, warm in our hearts. We love you, the soldiers tell them, reaching out to touch a forearm. These two men taken from kibbutz near Yitzhak by Hamas 4 long months ago, finally reunited with loved ones at the Sheba Hospital near Tel Aviv. Hugs and tears, a family whole again. Benjamin Netanyahu, who'd watched as it all unfolded, congratulated those involved.
You eliminated the kidnappers, the terrorists. You made your way back to Israel unscathed. Perfect operation, perfect execution.
But there are still so many more left in Hamas captivity. Israel is well practiced at this kind of daring special forces operation, but still it has only managed to extract 3 of the hostages militarily over the past 4 months. Striking some kind of a deal, as we saw last November, would be a far more effective way of bringing the rest of them home. Israel says the best way to force Hamas into a deal is to keep up the military pressure. This is what that looked like on Sunday night. A volley of strikes from air and sea to provide cover for special forces as they went in. Chaos in Rafah's hospitals. At least 67 dead, Gaza's health ministry says. Dozens more injured, women and children too. Not all of these would have been Hamas militants. And in the clear light of day, the devastation those airstrikes had unleashed. The Al-Huda Mosque in Rafah, where many of the displaced had sought out shelter, was trashed. And this is before Israel sends ground forces in a city now home to 1.4 million, most of whom have been displaced multiple times.
Give me a place to go. Is there anywhere safe in Gaza? Anywhere they said is safe, people go, and then they bomb them.
Israel is suggesting that the displaced evacuate back to the north, but there is considerable international pushback.
They can't go south into Egypt, they can't go north and back to their homes because many have been destroyed. So we are very concerned about the situation and we want Israel to stop and think very seriously before it takes any further action.
Israel seems in no mood to pause, but the IDF admits there's no quick fix either. And all the while, the death toll rises. The terrible cost of Hamas's actions and of Israel's response. Dana Magnay, Sky News, Jerusalem.
Speaking at a news conference in Washington tonight, US President Joe Biden and King Abdullah of Jordan called for restraint in Gaza.
The major military operation in Rafah should not proceed without a credible plan for ensuring the safety and support of more than 1 million people sheltering there. Many people there have been displaced multiple times, fleeing the violence to the north, and now they're packed into Rafah, exposed and vulnerable. They need to be protected.
We cannot stand by and let this continue. We need a lasting ceasefire now. This war must end.
Our US correspondent Mark Stone joins us now from Washington, D.C. And Mark, we heard from Lord Cameron today, and now more pressure from the region and from King Abdullah there of Jordan tonight to show restraint.
Yes, I mean, clearly the language is much, much stronger in public. And if they're saying this sort of thing in public, imagine, or you can assume that in private they are being much more forceful still to the Israelis about this possible Rafah offensive. I think it is clear that almost certainly the Rafah offensive is not about to happen. It will take quite a while for the Israelis to be able to put some sort of plan together to evacuate people where to, who knows, before it begins. And so I think this is an attempt to exert as much pressure on the Israelis as they possibly can. No doubt the language has changed. It's pressure on the Americans as well, too. We heard Josep Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, using extraordinarily strong language, blunt sarcasm when he said, where are they supposed to go, these refugees? Should they go to the moon? And he said of the Americans, because if you want to see less violence in Gaza, maybe you should provide less weaponry. I mean, very strong language, both directly to the Israelis, but also through the Americans as well. I think that is interesting. Of course, the wild card in all of this is Netanyahu himself. The expectation is that this Rafah offensive won't happen immediately, if at all. But hitherto, the Israelis, under the leadership of Netanyahu, have followed through on pretty much everything they said they'd do.
Mark, thank you. Nottinghamshire Police will be investigated for its conduct over the handling of the killings of Barnaby Webber, Grace O'Malley Kumar and Ian Coates. They were stabbed to death by Valdo Kalakane in the city in June last year. Family members of the victims believe police missed opportunities to prevent their deaths and there were serious failures in their investigations. Our Midland correspondent Becky Cottrell reports.
The brutal killings of Ian Coates, Barnaby Webber and Grace O'Malley Kumar shook Nottingham last summer. Now questions over how they may have been failed by the authorities are mounting. They were stabbed to death by Valdo Kalakane, a paranoid schizophrenic, seen here roaming the streets with a bag of knives. This was the moment Kalakane was arrested just after the attacks, still clutching a dagger. Now the police watchdog is investigating Nottinghamshire's force after complaints from the victims' families.
It's been an awful experience, as you can imagine, and we keep having to relive it. Every week seems to be more information that comes out, just shows like how much failure there is within this agency and how badly it needs to be looked into. We was told that there wasn't any drugs or alcohol in the system, but then we later found out that they didn't even do any tests. So we were lied to by the police.
Kalakane had previously assaulted a police officer and there was an outstanding arrest warrant for him at the time of the attacks. The police have admitted they should have done more to arrest him. This is what Barnaby Webber's mother had to say to that.
You have blood on your hands. If you had just done your jobs properly, there's a very good chance my beautiful boy would be alive today.
There are several reviews looking into not only the police, but also the mental health services that treated Kalakane.
It's horrific to keep reliving this, and because if all these reviews are independent, we're having to retell our stories from this beginning to these organisations over and over again.
The families asked the Prime Minister for a public inquiry. He hasn't ruled that out. Soon they'll hear whether the Attorney General will call for a tougher sentence for Kalakane. He's currently in a secure psychiatric facility. They'd like to see him face prison one day. All so they can get closer to something they feel looks like justice for Ian, Barnaby and Grace. Becky Cottrell, Sky News, Nottingham.
In Sudan, it's thought that more than 7 million people have been displaced since the conflict broke out last April. Armed clashes in the country and around the capital, Khartoum, have killed at least 12,000 people. Sudan is torn between the two warring factions. On one side are the Rapid Support Forces Militia, or RSF, backed by the UAE via Chad. They're the second largest armed faction in Sudan and are former security and political partners with the country's army. The Sudanese armed forces, now fighting against them, are backed by Iran, Egypt and Ukraine. When tensions boiled over in April, the RSF took control of key areas, including Khartoum, and a large part of the Darfur region in the west of Sudan, which you can see here in yellow. In December, after days of fighting, they also took control of the city of Madani, south of the capital. The Sudanese armed forces have now set up a de facto capital city in Port Sudan on the country's Red Sea coast, where students, teachers and housewives are being trained to defend themselves. Our Africa correspondent, Yusra El-Bagir, reports from Port Sudan.
This isn't female empowerment. This is a last resort. Students, teachers and housewives forced out of their homes, now training to fire a gun. Driven by the horror of their new reality and the little chance of leaving this country.
Why have you come to this training?
We've come to protect ourselves, our children, all we stand for against all we've seen, she says. We've seen so much. It's an insane tragedy. She says her nephew was killed by the RSF and that they abducted her niece.
Limit
The military is yet to restore their old lives. Destroyed by the militia, the army itself once partnered and trained. Now they're training these women to fight their shared enemy if this city falls to the RSF like so many others. Tucked in the corner of a military hospital is a dark picture of civilian recruitment. A bullet hit his spine through his shoulder, and the only movement left is in his face. He's 18 and he signed up, he says, because living conditions are so tough that he needs to pay. And now he's paralyzed, potentially for life. Did you see it coming, I ask. You don't see a bullet coming, he says. You just hear the sound and then it hits you. His carer is another new recruit, a 20-year-old university student, with no place to go now but the front line or the hospital.
We would be studying right now. We never had anything to do with the military. It wasn't even on our minds. But the RSF treated us in the most inhumane way, like we are dogs.
They're here from battlegrounds all over Sudan. And the loss of blood has come with the loss of loved ones. Ambushed in their homes by the RSF in pillaging of the worst kind. Civilian hospitals are heaving too. And the grief of dispossession is making illness even harder to fight.
I have nothing. They took everything in my home. Fridges, washing machines, air conditioners, motors, cupboards and beds. Everything.
Sudan now has the largest displaced population in the world, but funding for humanitarian support is barely trickling in.
You know, when you look at what's happening in the Middle East and Gaza, when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, there's a lot of competing demands for limited donor dollars. Sudan is the biggest humanitarian crisis we have today, and we desperately need international support.
For now, every free space is a shelter, and everyone we speak to is longing to leave. Syrians who came to Sudan for safety from their own war, struggling to resettle again after another traumatic upheaval. And the family they've made here, displaced many times in this war alone. In a split second, everything was destroyed, she says. A country already on its knees is now being strangled by violence, hunger, and disease. Sudan's trapped civilians are desperately holding on to life, only for each day of life to become harder to bear. Yusra al-Bagher, Sky News, Port Sudan.
It's been more than 50 years since Muriel McKay was murdered after being kidnapped by brothers Nizamuddin and Arthur Hussein. Now Sky News can reveal that Scotland Yard detectives are to fly to the Caribbean to interview the killer in their search for his victim's buried remains. Well, Sky's crime correspondent Martin Brunt has more on the story for us. And Martin, why have the police decided to go to the Caribbean now to interview the killer 50 years after the murder?
Simply because they've become convinced that the killer, Nizamuddin Hussein, is seriously trying to help the family by identifying precisely the spot where he buried Muriel McKay. Convinced too by our footage. We accompanied the family to Trinidad, Nizamuddin's home 2 weeks ago, and we filmed that extraordinary meeting between Muriel's daughter, Diane, and the killer. And we saw them poring over photographs, old and new, of the Hertfordshire farm all those years ago, where Nizam and his elder brother Arthur held Muriel ransom after kidnapping her in London, and where they negotiated with the police to pick up a reward money, but it didn't work out like that. Before anything could be arranged, according to the killer, Muriel McKay died of a heart attack. She was watching her family on a TV news report, appealing for information about her, and he said that he buried her behind the barn and he's been trying to show the police exactly where that spot is. So, armed with that information, the police want to talk to him themselves, and armed with that information, we'll come back and hopefully persuade the current landowner to let them go and search without a search warrant.
Martin, thank you. Former US President Donald Trump is asking the Supreme Court to extend the delay in his election interference trial, with his lawyers filing an emergency appeal. He claims he's immune from prosecution on charges he plotted to overturn his loss in the 2020 election. How quickly the Supreme Court acts could determine whether Mr. Trump stands trial before this November's election. Bosses at water companies responsible for illegal sewage spills will face a ban on their bonuses as part of efforts to clean up the nation's waterways. Campaigners have been calling for action after figures reveal that bosses took home more than £26 million in bonuses, benefits and incentives over the last 4 years. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, reports.
Like everywhere right now, it's wet in the Misbourne Valley in Buckinghamshire. That hasn't made Katie Hogarth's life any easier. She's got to feed her sheep, not just because the field's underwater, it's also flooded with raw sewage from the adjacent stream. Not the bonus she was expecting this year, and she doesn't think water bosses deserve one either.
So the sewage infrastructure issues in this valley and the groundwater egress has been a known problem for decades now. So there's been plenty of time to make improvements and to avoid the situation that we're in now. It seems like we're paying for the privilege of having sewage poured onto our own land, which is a bit of an insult.
It's no ordinary river either. The Misbourne is a protected chalk stream in the Chilterns area of outstanding natural beauty. So if you look down here, this grey, furry slime is called sewage fungus because it only grows in rivers that are significantly polluted with sewage. But you don't need to be an expert in freshwater ecology to know this is polluted, because sitting here I can actually smell the raw, untreated effluent that's being pumped into this chalk stream. Thames Water says it's working to fix the issue, but the situation is so bad. Last week, the Environment Agency classed this as a Category 1 pollution incident, as sewage is now contaminating the chalk aquifer used for drinking water and threatening an entire ecosystem. It's severe, but not an isolated incident. The latest annual data shows water companies in England alone discharge sewage into rivers for a combined total of 1.75 million hours. The latest intervention from government is for the water regulator Ofwat to consult on new powers to ban bonuses for water company bosses. Campaigners say it's just more of the same.
All we've had is a long sequence of regurgitating the same failed, ill-thought-through, undelivered policies of the past. The truth is, we need a change of administration. We also need a change of the regulatory system, because, by Lord, that's utterly failed both customers and the environment, and we probably need to have a serious look at who's running those companies.
There's no quick fix for failing sewers. Hundreds of billions of pounds will have to come from higher water bills or higher taxes to undo decades of underinvestment by water firms. But something has to be done to keep sewage where it's supposed to be. Tom Clark, Sky News, Buckinghamshire.
The world of athletics has been paying tribute to one of its most promising stars, marathon record holder Kelvin Kiptum, who was killed in a car crash last night. Kenya's sports minister has described the death of the 24-year-old as a dark day for their country. Our sports correspondent Rob Harris reports.
Kelvin Kiptum was an extraordinary talent, redefining greatness, winning his only 3 marathons, breaking the world record in his last. Domination achieved so early in his career, determined to create more history. He was back home in Kenya's Rift Valley, training for an attempt at a first 2 sub-hour marathon and the Olympics when he crashed his car into a tree. The 24-year-old died at the scene.
Kelvin lost control of the vehicle, veered off the road and entered into a ditch.
At the mortuary, his fellow athletes came to grieve.
He was in our team for the Olympics, so we are just in this world as we are nothing.
The tragedy has shaken the nation. Kenya's government mourning a superstar in the making.
A very dark day for our country, of a brilliant young man who had hit the top of the world.
Winning is all he knew. Running the fastest ever marathon debut in Valencia 14 months ago, breaking the London record last April, smashing the world record by 34 seconds in Chicago in October. This, the last time he would ever race.
Kiptum was a great athlete. He was one with a great talent. What he has achieved for the 3 marathons he ran was really wonderful. It was really amazing.
Kelvin Kiptum saw no limit to what he could achieve. His 3 marathons were among the 7 fastest of all time. His legacy, all the landmarks, and the brilliance lost. Rob Harris, Sky News.
Kelvin Kiptum, who's died at the age of 24. That was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview. Tonight, we're joined by The Sun's chief political correspondent, Jack Elson, and The New Statesman's associate political editor, Rachel Cunliffe. Amongst the stories we'll be discussing this on the front of The Guardian. Their headline, Labour cuts ties with Rochdale candidate over Israel comments. We'll be right back. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories. Labour has withdrawn its support for the Rochdale by-election candidate over offensive comments about October the 7th attacks on Israel after it originally backed Azhar Ali. The Foreign Secretary has urged Israel to hold back its military operation in Gaza amid growing concern about civilians in the southern city of Rafah. Nottinghamshire Police will be investigated for its conduct over its handling of the killings of Ian Coates and students Barnaby Webber and Grace O'Malley Kumar. You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with The Sun's chief political correspondent, Jack Elsom, and the New Statesman's associate political editor, Rachel Cunliffe. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. And many of the papers are leading with Labour's withdrawn support for their Rochdale candidate. The Daily Mail says Labour was forced to withdraw its support for Azhar Ali after the paper uncovered more of his anti-Semitic comments. The Guardian says the by-election was meant to be a key test for Sir Keir Starmer's party and that Azhar Ali will stand as a Labour candidate on the ballot paper, but if he's elected, he will not have the party whip. And the i-newspaper says this could hand the Tories or George Galloway an unlikely victory. With a different story, The Sun writes that Coronation Street star Bill Roache faces a High Court fight over his tax affairs after the newspaper revealed he owes HMRC over £500,000. The Financial Times leads with a story about founders and executives of the largest US private equity firms, such as Blackstone, who have seen their share value rise by more than $40 billion over the past year, benefiting from fast rising interest rates. The Metro speaks to the head of a primary school in Liverpool, who says he can't hire new staff because he's legally obliged to have a £30,000 a year contract with a private finance initiative for the upkeep of the school's playing fields. The Telegraph leads with a story about how former Home Secretary Suella Braverman says white people must not be made to feel guilty for being white amid a row over claims that the countryside is racist. The Daily Express writes that doctors may soon be able to diagnose dementia up to 15 years before the first symptoms emerge. The paper says scientists have developed a blood test with 90% accuracy. And the Daily Star warns that the nation's favourite brew could be in short supply. Now, a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Rachel Cunliffe and Jack Elsom. Welcome again to both of you. Let's start with the front page of The Guardian. This is the breaking news tonight that Labour is withdrawing its support for the Rochdale by-election candidate Azhar Ali. His name will still be on the ballot paper and, as I understand it, Labour will still be next to his name, but they have withdrawn their support for him.
Yes, it's a complete shambles for Labour. They started the day sending out shadow ministers to stand resolutely behind their candidate, Azhar Ali, and they've ended the day essentially pulling all support for him. So they have withdrawn any sort of campaign resources into the area. Party activists have been stood down, and we understand he's been suspended as a member of the Labour Party. Although because of this shambles around the dither and delay, essentially the deadline has passed to remove him from the ballot. And so Azhar Ali's name will still be on there. It'll be next to the Labour logo. And so people will go there potentially under the impression that he is still the Labour candidate. However, if he gets elected, he will go into the House of Commons. He won't take the Labour whip. He will sit as an independent MP and then potentially won't get reselected as the Rochdale candidate for the upcoming general election. So it's a complete mess Labour have got themselves into, and quite unnecessary in a week where actually Rishi Sunak should have been facing the pressure.
Rachel, was there anything else that they could have done, though, at this late stage?
Well, firstly, they could have vetted their candidates better, and I bet that they are wishing that they had done that. Obviously, that's something that would have to have happened earlier, but I think this raises some serious questions about the candidate selection process, and this is in one by-election. If they're selecting candidates now for a general election, particularly lots of candidates in seats where they're expected to win, safe Labour seats, are those candidate selection processes getting the scrutiny that we would like to see? And clearly the answer is no. In terms of could they have done anything, well, once the story broke over the weekend that the candidate had made these comments, it was already too late for them to change the candidate. However, they could have disowned the candidate at that point. They could have stopped supporting them, and they could have crucially not put shadow ministers out on the broadcast round saying, no, he's apologised, he's still the Labour candidate. So it's one of those instances where Labour are learning the lesson that if you are going to have to make a painful U-turn, the best thing you can do is make it promptly. You kill the story rather than have days and days of coverage, which is what we've seen here. It's actually quite similar to the story last week about Labour U-turning on its pledge to spend £28 billion on green investment. There was so much back and forth. Are they keeping it? Are they not keeping it? Keir Starmer came out on a Tuesday, I think, or a Monday, saying, no, we're definitely keeping it, only for it to be gone 2 days later. So it's another instance where if you have to make a painful decision, make it sooner rather than later.
But we read in the Mail that they've changed their minds, reportedly, because new comments, further comments have come to light that the Mail has revealed, and that really was the reason why they decided to withdraw support this evening.
Yeah, I think it was twofold. I think that definitely these latest comments reported by the Mail were the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think it also gave Labour insiders some cover almost to be able to ditch this candidate after spending the day defending him. And they can then go out and say, well, hang on a minute, the position still stood this morning. But obviously these new comments came to light, and therefore we are in a position where we can ditch him. However, there has been a groundswell of pressure all day for Labour to disown this candidate. And I think it was really quite an unsustainable position for Keir Starmer to be in, because every time a shadow minister will be sent out on the airwaves, they wouldn't be able to talk about anything else other than this candidate. Do you still support him? Do you stand by his comments? We saw it with Nick Thomas-Symonds earlier, the shadow Cabinet Office Minister, getting into a right old pickle about why he made these comments. And as Rachel said, it really sort of speaks to Keir Starmer's decision-making here, because we got into the same row last week with the 28 billion. And I think that what people found quite bizarre about the reluctance to disown Azhar Ali immediately is that in the past 4 years, Keir Starmer, in his drive to get rid of the toxicity of the Corbyn era, has been incredibly ruthless in ditching any Labour MPs from his party who have, the faintest whiff of anti-Semitism, quite rightly. And so I think that people found it a bit odd that he didn't act with the same pace and urgency with this candidate. It was pretty obvious to a lot of us that this candidate would have to go, and I think that by delaying the decision, Keir Starmer has only made his position 10 times worse.
Rachel, do you think if these further comments hadn't come to light, we'd still be in the same position we are tonight?
I think it would have been very difficult for Labour to continue backing the candidate, given that the first revelations, the first comment that was revealed was a conspiracy theory that Israel allowed the October 7th attacks to happen, which is a horrific thing to say. And there are sitting Labour MPs, or rather sitting MPs, who have been heavily sanctioned by the Labour Party for making comments about Israel and Gaza. So it really did look like a double standard, one rule for sitting MPs, another rule for candidates. I think it's definitely true that the fact that it was obviously going to be a distraction every time Labour was asked about anything. Obviously, Labour doesn't want to be talking about it this week. Labour wants to be talking, or will want to be talking, about the other by-elections that we have on Thursday, where they are expected to take 2 seats off the Conservatives, one of which was considered a very, very safe Conservative seat. So I think if you have a situation where every time anyone from Labour gets on any broadcast round, this is the question that they're asked, that's untenable. So I think even if these extra comments hadn't come to light, they would still have had to drop the candidate, which obviously raises the question, why didn't they do it earlier?
Yeah. And what does this mean for the Rochdale by-election in terms of the candidates? Or do we believe that Azhar Ali could still go ahead and win that?
Yeah, there's a high chance that he does. And I think that beforehand he was definitely the front runner, right? And there are still going to be some people who might not follow the cut and thrust of politics as closely as we do, see that he is the Labour candidate and put their tick next to his box. Obviously, George Galloway is also seen as doing very well in areas with big Muslim populations. And I think that probably it will be a two-horse race between those two at the moment.
And let's also remember that the other candidates in this particular by-election also have some baggage, shall we say.
Yeah.
Reform, which is Nigel Farage's populist party, they're running a candidate who was previously from Labour, who was suspended from Labour for sexting a teenager. The Green Party, I think, have also disowned their own candidate, who it turned out had made Islamophobic remarks. It's really not a good candidate selection for the people of Rochdale. And you'd hope that in a general election, all of those parties go away and look at their candidate selections and come back with some better options.
Could the Tories edge in, Jack?
I don't think so at the moment. I think that the Conservatives didn't hold this seat anyway, and it's seen that in even seats that they do hold, they haven't managed to cling on to them, so I'm not sure the Tories will be holding their breath to win Rochdale anytime soon.
Yeah, I think the most likely scenario is that the Labour candidate wins because voters don't realise that he is no longer the Labour candidate, takes his seat in the House of Commons as an independent, which is, you know, really surreal.
Yes.
How damaging, just very quickly from both of you, is this for the Labour Party?
I think it's quite damaging to Keir Starmer because it just feeds into this entire narrative that he is very incapable of making decisions, at least recently anyway. I think that he has actually managed to build up a quite good reputation with tackling anti-Semitism in his party. It's been hard fought. It's taken 4 years for him to burnish those credentials, but it takes just one bad case for all of that hard work to go up in smoke. You know, when Tony Blair was on the ascendancy into number 10, his mission to drag Labour back from the wilderness was often likened to carrying a priceless Ming vase across a slippery floor. It can come crashing down at any moment, no matter how close you are to the end. Keir Starmer now, he's within touching distance of number 10, needs to make sure that these pitfalls don't trip him up and that Ming vase doesn't come crashing down.
I would take a slightly different approach. I don't think this particular issue is going to be that disastrous for him. I don't think most voters outside of Rochdale are paying all that much attention to who the Labour candidate is then. But I do think Keir Starmer's indecision or his lack of ability to make a really tough decision and take the pain early on to let that story play out, that could really trip him up in future scenarios.
OK, Rachel and Jack, thank you very much for the moment. We're going to take a break. Coming up, we'll look at schools being forced to spend money on private finance initiatives rather than hiring new staff. Do stay with us.
So I think people are purchasing these mushrooms, maybe be purchasing them on the black market or illegally. They're purchasing them because they have this active ingredient called psilocybin. And I think when we think about magic mushrooms, we're thinking about people hallucinating and tripping out. But this story is talking particularly about people and mothers taking very small amounts of magic mushrooms, so microdosing with them. So not enough to have the visual disturbances that you associate with magic mushrooms, but they're reporting that they feel that it has positive benefits on their mental health. And actually, there has been a few studies in recent years that have shown that psilocybin, this active ingredient in magic mushrooms, can be beneficial in some mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, PTSD. However, these studies are very small, the data is very limited, and there is very limited research going into the long-term impacts of these mushrooms because magic mushrooms and psilocybin, this ingredient, is a Class A Schedule 1 drug. So it's in the same. It's illegal. It's illegal. It's in the same category as crack cocaine. So actually, it's very difficult for medics and for medical professionals to access these drugs, to do the research, to see the benefit about it. But I think what's interesting about this story is why more and more people, particularly mothers, are looking to things like mushrooms to help them with their mental health. Why are more and more people really struggling with daily stresses in life? And why are people, struggling to get the care that they need from the health service? Or why do they feel that the care that they get from the health service is not adequate in supporting them with their mental health? So my advice would be that we do not know yet the benefits or the risks or the harms with consuming these products. It remains a Class A drug, so it is illegal. So if you were found to be in possession of it, you can risk imprisonment of up to 7 years. And the side effects that you can get with it, you can get things like dizziness, fatigue, you can get paranoia, you can get quite negative feelings with it. There is a risk also that you take too much of it and you can overdose or take a bad trip. So I guess as a GP, I wouldn't be recommending my patients to take this. And I think we just really need to be doing some more research looking into whether or not these substances have benefit or potential harms as well with them.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview, still with me, Rachel Cunliffe and Jack Elson. Let's take a look at the FT front page and the picture there covering the rescue of the 2 hostages in Rafah. There obviously casualties as a result of that. Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, the picture really speaks for itself there. So the Israeli Defence Force launched a mission to rescue 2 of the hostages, and they are only the 2nd and 3rd hostages that the IDF has managed to rescue in a mission like this. All the other hostages have been negotiated part of exchanges. And Netanyahu called it a perfect operation, praised the troops that went in. At least 67 Palestinians killed as part of that, and real questions being raised now about what Israel's plan is now for the city of Rafah. Over 1 million Palestinians sheltering there. Many of them have been displaced more than once already. Israel's line is that there are still Hamas strongholds in the area and that they have to act. There are still over 100 Israeli hostages that Hamas holds. No clear plan from Hamas on the return of those. But now Joe Biden and David Cameron and other world leaders using increasingly strong language to warn Israel that they need to know what the plan is, and they need to show some more restraint than they have been so far.
The FT saying that a court in The Hague, meanwhile, has banned the export of spare parts for F-35 fighter jets to Israel. And the court has found a clear risk that serious violations of human rights law are being committed in the Gaza Strip with the use of Israel's F-35 fighter planes.
Yeah, and I think that just speaks to the latest attempt by the international community to send a message to Israel. It's obviously incredibly concerning what's happening in Gaza, and I think that a lot of Western leaders now are having to walk a bit of a tightrope, because when this conflict first started, the Western world was fully behind Israel in its objectives to, 1, get their hostages back, and 2, root out the evil that is Hamas. The position has obviously shifted in the last few months because of the scenes unfolding in Gaza. I mean, I remember being on this show a couple of months ago when the IDF was telling Palestinians in Gaza to move south to Rafah because they were going to be launching strikes and their missions in the sort of central of Gaza. Now they're talking about going into Rafah, where obviously there is a humanitarian crisis. And we saw Lord Cameron out there today in no uncertain terms saying, do not do that. Joe Biden saying that the Israeli response is over the top. And so I think that a lot of Western leaders are still keen to give Israel their backing. However, actions in the past few weeks have given them pause for thought. And I think that the language coming out of both the White House, Downing Street, The Hague, as we're seeing this afternoon, should hopefully make Benjamin Netanyahu sit up and assess what he's doing.
And that line is to show restraint. We've just got about a minute. Let's have a look at this story on the front page of the Metro. Rachel, playing field idiocy. What's the detail to this story?
This is absolutely extraordinary. This is a primary school that can't hire classroom staff because it is having to pay £30,000 a year on a contract, essentially, to cut the playing fields and to keep up the upkeep of the school, which was a contract negotiated when the private company helped build the school and helped finance it. This is a private finance initiative that obviously there were a Conservative policy from the 90s, ballooned under New Labour. And I think real questions here about how many contracts like this are there, how many schools are affected, and even if it is technically within the terms of the contract, I think the people in charge of those companies really ought to be brought before Parliament to answer some serious questions.
Yeah, indeed. We must leave it there just because of time, but thank you both, Jack and Rachel. We'll see you in the next hour. Let's take a look at the weather now.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, we're in for a fairly mild week, but it will be unsettled for most. Northern and eastern parts will have a mostly fine, if frosty, start tomorrow, but there'll be wintry showers in the northwest. Southwestern Britain and the south of Ireland will be milder, but largely overcast with outbreaks of rain. Scotland will keep some good sunny spells through the morning, but blustery showers will continue over northwestern parts.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Coming up next on Sky News at 11, Labour withdraws support for the Rochdale by-election candidate Azhar Ali over his offensive comments about October the 7th attacks.